Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Science Behind the Growth Leader Assessment. My name is James Eyring. I'm the CEO of Organization Solutions, and I was the lead creator behind the Growth Leader Assessment. And today, I just want to take you through a little bit of the research behind the Growth Leader Assessment and let you know how to access even more research if you're interested. We started doing research on growth over 20 years ago, and we started first in China looking at how companies were growing and what was enabling or hindering that growth. We then expanded it to look at either region, division, or global companies and their growth rates and what their demands were. And we specifically interviewed CEOs and business unit leaders, and we talked to them about their strategies, what their demands were, what the enablers were. And we divided those groups into two areas. One was the low growth CEOs, and another was the high growth. Low growth, on average, was growing around 2.5% year over year. The high growth companies or the high growth business units were growing around 23%. So really different demands in the organization based on that. And what we found was the interviews really told different stories. The challenge on the low growth often was to accelerate growth. They were under tremendous pressure by stakeholders to bring revenue up. And often they talked about capabilities that they needed in the business around things like growth mindset, innovation, agility, and speed. And they really saw this much more as a culture change to accelerate growth that they needed. And they thought that the individuals and the capabilities they needed were really different to be able to do that. When we spoke to the high growth business unit leaders, we found some really different dynamics. Their challenge was to sustain growth. They had high growth. They just wanted to sustain it, possibly increase it. But their biggest worry was that the pace of the business was outgrowing the pace of the development of the individuals in the business. And because they were growing so fast, they needed to get their managers to better manage people because they were promoting individual contributors into manager roles and manager roles so quickly. They needed to increase those capabilities. They needed their people to develop others so that they could get ready for that growth. And they needed to spend a lot of time just aligning the organization. Because they added so many people and they were growing so fast, that the tendency was for the organization to kind of drift and to work at competing purposes. And so they needed managers and leaders to align the organization. Based on some of this early research, we started thinking about what capabilities were important for growth, even though some capabilities were more important for people in a high growth environment and some capabilities were more important for people in a low growth environment. We then started looking at some of the academic research on growth and what we could learn from other research studies that were rigorous and conducted in peer-reviewed journals. One set of that research was around entrepreneurs. And at the time, much research was conducted around the 5-factor model. These are sort of the big 5 personality factors. If you measure leadership in your organization or you use a Hogan or an OPQ type of instrument, those are measuring 5-factor models. And you can see them over there: conscientious, emotional stability, openness, etc. What was fascinating about this research, though, is that it was conducted mostly in business schools. And if you look across all of the research body, hundreds of research studies on entrepreneurs, one thing that is interesting is you compare the entrepreneurs on the 5-factor model and what they called contextual traits. And these were things like entrepreneurial orientation. So did the entrepreneur take risks? Were they proactive, et cetera? Did they have that ambition, that need for achievement? Were they innovative in driving innovation and creativity? Were they proactive? A whole number of things in the contextual traits. And researchers looked at both of these factors. One of the things that we thought was most interesting is that the contextual traits were 2 times more important than the 5-factor model traits. So the traditional leadership traits were important, but the contextual traits were even so much more important for entrepreneurial success. We found even in research that when they started doing the same studies in large organizations, we found the same thing. So those contextual traits, perhaps more important than what many organizations are measuring today. Second is we found entrepreneurs. One of the biggest differences was they were lower on managers than agreeableness. Entrepreneurs scored higher than managers in large companies on almost everything except for agreeableness. In other words, entrepreneurs irritated people. They irritated people in driving that growth. And so in an organization, it's important to keep in mind that those growth leaders may cause a little bit of irritation. It's more important for those growth leaders to connect and bring others with them in big organizations, but they still may push and make others uncomfortable. The second thing that we looked at was growth at an organization level. What drove an organization to grow? And research on this was across many, many companies. And so you looked across industries, across companies, what tended to drive growth? And this summarizes a lot of that research. And you'll see on this chart, the biggest factor that drove growth was entrepreneurial orientation of the organization. So this isn't about the individual. This is about the organization itself. Is the organization proactive? Does the organization allow risk taking? And do they allow that innovativeness to come out? That was the largest factor that determined large company growth. The second one was managerial capacity. Did they have the managers that they needed to enable growth? Did they have innovation in the business? And you look down and you see sort of smaller and smaller effect sizes, still very important for growth. But if you look at the negative ones, firm age tended to get in the way of growth. Certainly my market dynamics and competition also could get in the way of growth. One of the things that we took away from this, though, is if you look at 4 of those areas, entrepreneurial orientation, managerial capacity, innovation, and market orientation, these are things that were behaviors or practices or routines that the organization drove. It's not about some leader's personality. It's not about an entrepreneur. It's about how the company operated. It wasn't how much they spent on their advertising budget, but it was, were they externally focused? Were they encouraging of innovation? And so what you can see is that in the psychology field, personality practices were really important, but what we found in the business research on growth, it was not that personality. There was a lot of other factors that drove growth in terms of practices that managers used in the organization. One area that we deep dove into was innovation. And this summarizes studies for decades on innovation, the factors that drive individual level innovation. And these are correlations. And if you look at them, they're rank ordered. So at the top there, you have role expectation. So one of the biggest drivers of me innovating is it expected in my role? Does my manager expect me to innovate? Does the business expect me to innovate? That expectation really helps set the standard that I need to achieve in terms of innovation. Other factors, my creative self-efficacy. Do I believe and am I confident that I can be creative? The autonomy I have. Can I make decisions to affect my job? Job challenge, again, interesting. The more challenged I was in my job, the more innovative I was. My relationship with my manager, the resources I received, etc. Interestingly, when we looked at research like this, only 2 factors were related to something about within the individual, their personality. Did they have a creative personality, and were they open to new ideas, which is part of that creative personality? So they were important, but they weren't not in the top 5 factors that drove innovation. What drove innovation were all these other things outside the individual. Out of all of that research, and we started looking through lots of academic research, our own research, what we found were 9 capabilities that drive growth. And these are put into 3 broad categories: perform, energize, and transform. In perform, you can see structure and execute growth plans, manage complexity and build resilience. Energize, set vision, inspire action, develop and empower talent, and build stakeholder relationships. And transform, shape external focus and alignment, lead innovation, and drive new opportunities. Each of these capabilities is important for driving different aspects of growth. It could be revenue growth, profit growth, productivity, but also factors like psychological safety, team morale, and engagement. So they're all important in driving important organization outcomes. As we put this together, we started to design and implement measures of those 9 capabilities. We measured each capability in 2 ways. We had a style, that was that personality, that mindset, These things change slowly. That was like those big 5-factor models, the personality factors. We also measured strategies, and those were things that leaders did, their practices, their routines. I like to think of these as skills that the leaders learned, and they change quickly, and perhaps more importantly is they change by level of leader. So as I go from individual contributor to people manager to manager, managers on up, the strategies that I needed changed. And the third thing we measured outside of the growth leader assessment through our Growth Leader 360 was outcomes. What do others observe? And what we find is that if I have those styles and strategies, those together really drive the outcomes. And some styles and strategies are more important than others, but they're all important. If we look at how that plays out for an area like structure and execute growth plans, this is one capability that we measure. The style is tenacity. It's similar to conscientiousness, but it's defined a little bit more broadly. It includes proactivity, and think of this as grit overall, if you're familiar with grit. And then the strategies are focus and align. This is what the leaders do. Do they focus their teams? Do they set a few critical priorities? Do they monitor performance? And are they aligning their stakeholders? And what you find is that both of these areas predict performance, both individual performance, revenue, and productivity. They also predict team performance and cross-team performance because you're aligning people across teams to drive outcomes. So both of these are really big drivers of those. Focus and align is a measure unique to the growth leader assessment. And so we've not done research on all outcomes, but so what we find is that tenacity in the broader research also drives outcomes such as perseverance, people persevering when they have challenges, motivation and commitment. People actually avoid having deviant behavior. In other words, they don't steal, they're tenacious, and they have better health and well-being. So tenacity has a broader impact. We've not done as much research on focus and align, but we know that it also impacts performance, team performance, and cross-team performance. As another example, set vision and inspire action really drives a lot about motivation. And the style here is relationship oriented. In research, it's often called agreeableness. I get along with people. We measure a portion of that. And then the strategies are motivate. And these are about communication skills. And it's specific about how I communicate to motivate people. And we talk about it is, do I communicate purpose? Do I communicate support? And do I involve people in improving the workplace? So there were sort of 3 different elements of this motivate factor. And those also vary by level in the organization. Relationship oriented and motivate both predict performance. And that is, again, hard performance of leaders or outcomes of the organization. And it predicts motivation. Relationship oriented, that one factor, also predicts team performance, relationship investment, the amount I invest in a relationship with somebody else, and social integration. We've not looked at that with the motivate strategies yet, but it probably would be related to those. But the research right now we have is really just based on the relationship-oriented factor. And then motivate also, we know, predicts productivity. And when you think about it, that makes sense, is that if you want to improve productivity, you really need to motivate people to make the improvement changes that are needed to improve that productivity. So overall, what we find is that the growth leader assessment predicts business outcomes. And just as an example, growth mindset, interestingly, predicts revenue growth. Groups or teams, or should I say leaders with a high growth mindset, lead their teams to be much more, have much higher revenue growth year over year. Productivity, developing the team drives productivity because you are investing in improving capabilities of the team, and then they can then be more productive. In employee turnover, interestingly, things like organization innovation drives lower turnover because if you're innovating, you're also creating new opportunities to drive revenue, and people want to stay in the organization. As I mentioned earlier, some styles are very important. Tenacity, growth mindset, composure. Some style and strategy combinations are important together. Some operate differently for different outcomes. So the complexity of a factor with an outcome is that some factors are related to some outcomes and some are not. And that's why we say all of these capabilities are important, but they're not all important for every job. If you want to see more research, please contact us for a technical manual. We go through sort of the research base on this, the development history of the GLA, reliability, content construct, and criterion validity and benchmarks. So lots of information that if you want some details, please let us know. Thanks for your time.